Richard Ashford stepped out of his black Mercedes, adjusting his Rolex as he surveyed the construction site before him. The November wind bit through his tailored suit, but he barely noticed. This 20-story development in the heart of Manhattan represented his latest triumph, another jewel in his real estate empire worth over $3 billion. At 52, Richard had built everything from nothing, clawing his way up from a childhood in the projects to become one of New York's most feared businessmen. He demanded perfection, tolerated no weakness, and believed that money could solve any problem. His assistant hurried beside him, tablet in hand, rattling off numbers and schedules. Richard half listened, his mind already racing ahead to the evening's charity gala where he would network with politicians and fellow titans of industry. These events bored him, but they were necessary theater. He would write a check, shake hands, and reinforce his image as a philanthropist, even though he privately considered most charity work a waste of resources. As they walked toward the site office, a small figure suddenly darted in front of them. Richard stopped short, irritation flashing across his face. A boy, no more than 10 years old, stood blocking their path. His clothes were worn and patched, his sneakers held together with duct tape. Dirt smudged his cheek, and his dark hair stuck up in several directions. But his eyes blazed with determination. "Mr. Ashford," the boy said, his voice steady despite the obvious trembling in his hands. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Richard's security guard moved forward immediately, but Richard held up a hand. Something about the boy's directness intrigued him. In his world, everyone approached him with either groveling respect or calculated charm. This child showed neither. "You have 30 seconds, Richard said coldly. "Make it count." The boy swallowed hard and lifted a worn shopping bag. From it, he carefully extracted a shirt, crisp white cotton with subtle blue pinstripes. Richard recognized it immediately. It was from his favorite Italian designer, part of a custom collection that cost $1,500 per shirt. He owned a dozen of them. "Sir, your son gave me this shirt yesterday," the boy said, holding it out like an offering. Richard's blood ran cold. His son. Daniel. 22 years old, supposedly studying business at Columbia University. The son he had groomed since birth to take over the Ashford empire. The boy he had molded in his own image, teaching him that weakness was unacceptable and sentiment was for fools. "Where did you see my son?" Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. His assistant stepped back instinctively, recognizing the tone that preceded explosive anger. The boy didn't flinch. "At the shelter on 42nd Street. Your son volunteers there every Tuesday and Thursday evening. He serves meals, talks to people, helps them fill out job applications. Yesterday, a man came in who needed clothes for a job interview. Your son took off his own shirt and gave it to him. He told the man that everyone deserves dignity and a fair chance." The words hit Richard like physical blows. His son, his heir, working at a homeless shelter? Giving away expensive clothes to strangers? It was impossible. It was humiliating. It was everything Richard had taught him not to be. "You're lying," Richard said flatly. "My son is studying for his MBA. He has no time for such nonsense." The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, old and cracked. He swiped through photos and held it up. There was Daniel, unmistakable in jeans and a simple t-shirt, his arm around an elderly homeless man, both of them laughing. Another photo showed Daniel ladling soup into bowls. Another captured him sitting on the floor, teaching a group of children to read. Richard stared at the images, his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. He had given Daniel everything: the best schools, international travel, connections that most people would kill for. He had taught him that the world was divided into winners and losers, and that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. Yet here was evidence that his son had rejected everything he stood for. "Why are you showing me this?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. The boy looked up at him with eyes far older than his years. "Because yesterday, after your son gave away his shirt, he told me something. He said that his father once had a good heart, before the world made him hard. He said that deep down, you still remembered what it was like to be poor, to be hungry, to be invisible. He asked me to find you and remind you." Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine emotion breaking through his armor. His hands shook as he took the shirt from the boy. The fabric felt heavy with meaning, with accusation, with a truth he had spent 30 years trying to forget. "What else did he say?" Richard whispered. The boy smiled sadly. "He said that he loves you, but he can't become you. He said that real strength isn't about crushing others. It's about lifting them up." Richard dismissed his assistant with a sharp gesture and turned to his security guard. Get the car. Wait for me there. His voice left no room for argument. When they were alone, Richard looked down at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. The child's face was thin, hollow beneath the cheekbones in a way that spoke of missed meals and hard nights. Yet his posture remained straight, proud despite his circumstances. What's your name? Richard asked, softer now. Marcus, sir. Marcus Thompson. The boy shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable but refusing to back down. And what do you want from me, Marcus? Money? Is this some elaborate scheme? Richard's instincts kicked in, the suspicious nature that had protected him from countless con artists and opportunists over the years. Marcus shook his head firmly. I don't want your money, Mr. Ashford. Your son already helped me. He got me enrolled in the after-school program at the shelter. He tutors me in math twice a week. He's teaching me that my circumstances don't define my future. The boy paused, choosing his next words carefully. I came because I owe him. And because he talks about you sometimes, when he thinks nobody's listening. He sounds so sad, sir. Like he's lost something precious and doesn't know how to get it back. Richard felt his throat tighten. When had he last really talked to Daniel? Not about business strategies or networking opportunities, but actually talked? He couldn't remember. Their interactions had become transactional, brief exchanges of information between board meetings and business dinners. He had convinced himself this was preparation, toughening Daniel up for the brutal world of high-stakes commerce. Take me to the shelter, Richard said suddenly. Right now. Marcus's eyes widened. But sir, your son isn't there today. He only volunteers on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today's Wednesday. I don't care. I want to see this place that's apparently more important to my son than his own future. Richard pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his driver with the address Marcus provided. 20 minutes later, Richard Ashford walked through the doors of St. Catherine's shelter for the first time in his life. The smell hit him immediately, industrial cleaner mixed with body odor, cheap coffee, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of folding tables and plastic chairs. People of all ages filled the space, some eating, others simply sitting with the vacant expressions of those who had given up hope. A woman in her 60s approached, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a faded St. Catherine's volunteer shirt and carried herself with the efficiency of someone who had seen everything and could no longer be shocked. Can I help you? She asked, eyeing Richard's expensive suit with open suspicion. I'm looking for information about one of your volunteers. Daniel Ashford. He's my son. The woman's entire demeanor transformed. Her face lit up with genuine warmth. Daniel. Oh, he's wonderful. One of our best volunteers. The clients adore him, especially the children. She extended her hand. I'm Margaret Chen, the shelter director. Daniel's told me about you. Richard shook her hand mechanically, bracing himself. What exactly has he said? Margaret gestured for him to follow her to a quieter corner of the room. That you're brilliant, driven, successful. That you built an empire from nothing. That he respects you enormously but wishes you could see the world differently. She paused, studying him. He says you taught him to be strong, but he wants to use that strength differently than you do. Richard felt exposed under her gentle scrutiny. This woman, who probably earned less in a year than he spent on shoes, somehow made him feel small. How long has he been volunteering here? 3 years, Margaret replied. He started coming during his sophomore year at Columbia. At first, he just served meals. But he kept coming back, getting more involved. Now he runs our job readiness program, helps with homework tutoring, mentors some of our clients who are trying to turn their lives around. She smiled. Your son has a gift for seeing potential in people that others overlook. 3 years. For 3 years, Daniel had been living this secret life, building relationships and making a difference while Richard had remained oblivious, focused on profit margins and market shares. The realization stung like a slap. Can I look around? Richard asked. Margaret nodded. Of course. Marcus, would you show Mr. Ashford around? As Marcus led him through the shelter, Richard saw things that shattered his comfortable assumptions. A young mother with 2 small children, her face marked by a black eye that makeup couldn't quite hide, quietly feeding her babies while her own plate sat untouched. An elderly veteran, his hands shaking from Parkinson's, struggling to hold his coffee cup. A teenager, barely older than Daniel, with track marks on his arms and eyes that pleaded for redemption. These weren't the faceless statistics Richard saw in newspaper articles about poverty. They were people, each with stories and struggles and dreams that had been crushed by circumstances, bad decisions, or simply rotten luck. For the first time in decades, Richard remembered being 8 years old, hungry and cold, watching his mother choose between paying rent and buying food. He remembered the shame of wearing donated clothes to school, the sting of other children's mockery, the desperate determination to escape poverty no matter the cost. He had escaped. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what it felt like to be trapped. He had armored himself in wealth and success, convinced that his ruthlessness was justified because he had earned his place at the top. Now, seeing his son's work through Marcus's eyes, he wondered what he had really accomplished. He had built towers of steel and glass, but had he built anything that mattered? Marcus stopped before a bulletin board covered in drawings and thank you notes. "This is from the kids in the after-school program," he explained. "We make these for volunteers who help us." Richard scanned the board. Many were addressed to Daniel. "Dear Daniel, thank you for helping me with my homework. You make me believe I can go to college someday. Daniel, you're the best tutor ever. I got an A on my math test. Thank you for teaching me that being poor doesn't mean being stupid." That last one, written in careful block letters, nearly broke him. Richard sat in his study that evening, the expensive scotch in his hand untouched, Daniel's shirt draped across his desk like an accusation. The house felt enormous and empty around him. His wife, Catherine, had left 5 years ago, tired of being married to a man who treated even his family like a corporate acquisition. She had taken nothing but her personal belongings and her dignity, telling him that he had confused success with happiness for so long that he no longer knew the difference. He hadn't fought to keep her. At the time, he had told himself she was weak, unable to handle the demands of his lifestyle. Now he wondered if she had been the strong one, brave enough to walk away from everything he offered in search of something real. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. Daniel was home. Richard checked his watch, 11:30. Late for a Wednesday night. He heard his son's footsteps on the marble floor of the foyer, heading toward the stairs. "Daniel," Richard called out, his voice echoing through the house. "Come here." A pause, then footsteps approaching the study. Daniel appeared in the doorway, and Richard was struck by how much he looked like Catherine. Same warm brown eyes, same gentle mouth. Only the sharp jawline came from Richard's side of the family. Daniel wore jeans and a Columbia sweatshirt, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked tired but content in a way Richard never felt despite his billions. "Dad. I didn't know you were still up." Daniel's eyes fell on the shirt on the desk, and his expression shifted from surprise to understanding to resignation. "I see you met Marcus. Sit down." Richard gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "We need to talk." Daniel settled into the chair with the wary posture of someone entering a battlefield. "Let me guess. You're furious that I've been volunteering at a homeless shelter instead of networking with your business associates. You think I'm wasting my time and embarrassing the family name. Is that really what you think of me?" Richard asked quietly. "That I'm so shallow, so heartless, that I would be angry about you helping people. Aren't you?" Daniel challenged. "You've spent my entire life teaching me that the world is divided into predators and prey, that showing compassion is weakness, that the only thing that matters is winning. You fired your CFO last month because he asked for time off to be with his dying mother. You bought out Henderson Properties just to destroy Marcus Henderson because he outbid you on a contract 10 years ago. You've turned ruthlessness into an art form." Each accusation landed like a hammer blow because Richard couldn't deny any of them. He had done all those things, justified them as necessary business decisions. But hearing them from his son's mouth, seeing the disappointment in those familiar eyes, made them sound like sins instead of strategies. "You're right," Richard said, and watched shock register on Daniel's face. "About all of it. I have been ruthless. I have been cold. I convinced myself that this was strength, that this was what it took to survive in a brutal world." He picked up the shirt, running his fingers over the fabric. "But Marcus told me something today that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said you told him I used to have a good heart, before the world made me hard." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I remember stories Grandma used to tell me, before she died. About how you would give away your lunch to kids who had nothing. How you stood up to bullies even when you got beaten for it. How you dreamed of becoming a teacher so you could help kids like you escape poverty." His voice softened. "What happened to that person, Dad? When did you decide that making money was more important than making a difference?" Richard closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. He remembered being 15, watching his father die of a heart attack because they couldn't afford proper medical care. He remembered the landlord who evicted them 2 weeks later, putting their belongings on the street like garbage. He remembered the hunger, the cold, the constant fear, and the rage that grew inside him like a tumor. He had sworn that he would never be vulnerable again, never be at anyone's mercy. Money became his armor, his weapon, his god. I was terrified, Richard admitted, opening his eyes. Every day of my childhood, I was terrified. Terrified of being hungry, of being homeless, of being nothing. When I started making money, that fear didn't go away. It just changed shape. I became afraid of losing it all, of ending up back where I started. So I built walls and convinced myself that anyone who wasn't building walls was a fool. But you're not that scared kid anymore, Dad. Daniel's voice carried both frustration and compassion. You've been a billionaire for 20 years. You have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. When is it enough? When do you stop running from a past that can't hurt you anymore? Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline lit up against the night sky. How many of those buildings had he bought, sold, or developed? How many lives had he changed, and not always for the better? He thought about the families displaced by his luxury developments, the small businesses crushed by his expansion plans, the employees treated as expendable resources. He had told himself these were necessary casualties in the war of commerce. But they were people, just like the ones in the shelter. Just like he had once been. I saw the bulletin board today, Richard said, still facing the window. The thank you notes from the children you tutor. One of them said you taught them that being poor doesn't mean being stupid. He turned back to face his son. That's what people used to say to me. Teachers, social workers, even my own relatives. They acted like poverty was proof of inferior intelligence or character. Like we deserved our circumstances. And you proved them wrong, Daniel said. You built an empire. You showed everyone that you were smarter and tougher than they ever imagined. But somewhere along the way, you started treating others the way those people treated you. You became the thing you hated. The truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. He had spent 3 decades punishing the world for his childhood suffering, never realizing that his victims were often people just like his younger self. People trying desperately to survive, to provide for their families, to maintain their dignity in a system designed to crush them. I don't know how to be different, Richard confessed, his voice raw. This is who I've been for so long. I don't even know if that kid who gave away his lunch still exists inside me. Daniel stood and walked over to his father. He does, Dad. I saw glimpses of him when I was little. Before you let the business consume everything. Before Mom left. Before you decided that showing emotion was weakness. He placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. Marcus came to find you because I told him about those glimpses. Because part of me still believes that man is in there somewhere, buried under decades of armor. Why? Richard asked. After everything, why would you believe that? Because you're my father, Daniel said simply. And because I've spent 3 years working with people who've lost everything, who've made terrible mistakes, who've been crushed by life. And I've seen them change. I've seen addicts get clean, abusers learn gentleness, thieves discover honesty. If they can transform, so can you. He paused. But you have to want to. You have to be willing to feel again, even though it hurts. Especially because it hurts. Richard looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not a reflection of himself but something better. Something he could have been if fear hadn't poisoned him. Teach me, he whispered. Show me how to be the person I was supposed to become. The next Tuesday evening, Richard Ashford did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He put on jeans and a simple shirt and left his security detail at home. He met Daniel outside St. Catherine's shelter, feeling absurdly nervous. His son smiled at him, an expression of cautious hope that made Richard's chest ache. Ready? Daniel asked. No, Richard admitted. But let's do it anyway. Inside, Margaret greeted them with warm surprise. Mr. Ashford. Back so soon? Her eyes flickered between father and son, clearly curious but too polite to pry. I'd like to volunteer, Richard said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. If you'll have me. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We can always use an extra pair of hands. Daniel, why don't you show your father the ropes? For the next 3 hours, Richard served meals, cleared tables, and listened. He met Carlos, a former construction worker whose company went bankrupt, leaving him without severance or health insurance. He talked with Diane, a woman who fled domestic violence with her 3 children and nothing else. He heard Tommy's story about losing his job to automation, then his apartment, then his dignity. Each person shattered another piece of Richard's carefully constructed worldview. The work was physically demanding in a way that surprised him. His back ached from bending over tables. His feet hurt from standing on concrete floors. His hands grew raw from washing dishes in industrial sinks. He had forgotten what it felt like to be tired from labor rather than stress. There was something honest about it, something that made him feel more present than he had in years. During a break, Marcus found him sitting on a folding chair, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension. "You came back," the boy said, sounding pleased but not entirely surprised. "I did," Richard confirmed. "Thank you for finding me last week. For having the courage to do what you did." Marcus shrugged with the casual grace of childhood. "Your son's been good to me. To all of us. Seemed like you should know about it." "Tell me something," Richard said. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Marcus's face lit up. "An architect. I want to design buildings that help people instead of just making money. Like community centers and affordable housing. Daniel says I'm good at drawing, that I have vision." The boy pulled a worn notebook from his backpack and opened it carefully. Page after page showed sketches of buildings, parks, and public spaces, all drawn with meticulous detail and surprising sophistication. Richard felt something shift inside his chest. "These are remarkable, Marcus. Truly. An idea formed, one that would have been unthinkable a week ago. How would you like to tour one of my construction sites? See how buildings actually get made?" Marcus's eyes went wide. "Really? You'd do that?" "Consider it payment for delivering that shirt," Richard said, surprised by the warmth in his own voice. As the evening continued, Richard found himself in conversation with James, a man in his 40s who had been a mid-level manager before downsizing and divorce left him with nothing. They talked about business, strategy, and the brutal realities of corporate culture. James was intelligent and articulate, offering insights that reminded Richard of his own executives. "You should be running a company, not living in a shelter," Richard said bluntly. James laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the 100 places that won't hire me because of my address. Having a shelter on your resume is like having a criminal record. People assume you're damaged, unreliable, probably an addict or mentally ill." "Are you?" Richard asked. "None of those things. Just unlucky and too proud to ask for help until it was too late." James met his eyes. "We're not all that different, you and I. Just a few bad breaks separating your life from mine." The statement haunted Richard for days. A few bad breaks. That's all it had been for him too, except his breaks had gone the other way. The teacher who recognized his potential. The scholarship that paid for business school. The mentor who took a chance on a hungry kid with big dreams. Without those breaks, he could easily be James, sleeping on a cot in a shelter, trying to reconstruct a shattered life. Over the following weeks, Richard kept coming back. Tuesday and Thursday evenings became sacred, time blocked off his calendar with the same importance as board meetings. His executives noticed the change, whispering behind his back about their boss's strange new hobby. Richard didn't care. For the first time in decades, he was discovering purpose beyond profit. He started small, using his connections to help shelter clients. He called in favors to get people job interviews, provided references for those with gaps in their employment history, and quietly paid for medical procedures that kept people from working. But he did it discreetly, through Margaret, never wanting credit or recognition. The satisfaction came from seeing Carlos return to work, watching Diane's children start to smile again, knowing that Tommy had an apartment and a steady paycheck. Daniel watched his father's transformation with a mixture of hope and caution, like someone observing a wounded animal they desperately wanted to trust but knew might still bite. They started having dinner together once a week, real conversations that went beyond business updates. Richard asked about Daniel's classes, his dreams, his life. He listened without judgment or unsolicited advice, a discipline that required constant effort but grew easier with practice. One evening, as they cleaned up after the meal service, Daniel said quietly, "Mom called me yesterday." Richard's hands stilled in the dishwater. He hadn't spoken to Catherine in 6 months, their divorce finalized but the wounds still raw. "How is she?" "Happy. She's teaching art at a community college in Vermont, dating a widower who runs a bookstore. She sounds lighter, Dad. Like a weight's been lifted." Daniel hesitated. "She asked about you. What did you tell her?" "That you're trying. That you're changing. That maybe the man she fell in love with is finding his way back." Daniel dried a plate with careful attention. She said she'd like to see that for herself someday. Not to get back together, but to know that you're okay. Richard felt tears prick his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that he didn't try to suppress. I destroyed our family because I was too afraid to be human. Too afraid that if I let myself feel, all the pain I'd been running from would catch up with me. And has it? Daniel asked softly. Every day, Richard admitted. But it's bearable. And somehow, feeling the pain makes the joy more real too. 6 months after Marcus brought him that shirt, Richard Ashford stood before the board of Ashford Properties and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the Manhattan business community. He was restructuring the company's mission, dedicating 20% of all future projects to affordable housing, creating a foundation funded with $1 billion to support homeless services and job training programs, and implementing a policy that no development would displace low-income residents without providing equivalent housing alternatives. The board members sat in stunned silence. Finally, Gerald Morrison, the CFO Richard had fired for taking time off during his mother's illness, spoke up. Richard, this will cost us hundreds of millions in lost profits. Our shareholders will revolt. Then let them, Richard said calmly. I'm the majority shareholder, and I'm more interested in building a legacy than maximizing quarterly earnings. We've spent decades extracting value from communities. It's time we started creating it. He paused, looking at each board member in turn. And Gerald, I owe you an apology. You were fired for being human, for prioritizing what actually matters. I was wrong. If you're willing, I'd like you to return as CFO with a substantial raise and a new policy that guarantees family leave for all employees. Gerald stared at him, searching for the trap, the angle, the hidden agenda. Finding none, he slowly nodded. I'd like that. Thank you. The meeting continued for 3 more hours, contentious and difficult, but Richard held firm. 2 board members resigned, unable to reconcile this new direction with their profit-driven philosophy. Richard let them go without argument and replaced them with people who understood that business could be both profitable and purposeful. That evening, Richard returned to St. Catherine's for a special occasion. The shelter was hosting a graduation ceremony for participants who had completed their job training program and secured employment. Marcus had helped organize it, designing certificates and decorations with his artistic flair. The room buzzed with an energy that Richard had learned to recognize: hope. Margaret took the podium, her voice carrying across the crowded space. Tonight, we celebrate 23 individuals who refused to let circumstances define them. They worked hard, stayed focused, and proved that everyone deserves a second chance. She began calling names, and one by one, people Richard had come to know walked forward to receive their certificates and share their stories. Carlos spoke about his new job as a site supervisor, his voice breaking as he thanked Daniel for believing in him when no one else would. Diane announced that she and her children had moved into their own apartment, that she was training to become a paralegal, that her ex-husband would never hurt them again. Tommy, usually quiet and withdrawn, stood tall as he described his position as a warehouse manager, his eyes wet but proud. Then Margaret called a name that made Richard's breath catch. James Morrison. James walked to the front, wearing a suit that Richard recognized as one Daniel had helped him pick out. 3 months ago, I was convinced my life was over, James began. I'd lost everything, my career, my home, my sense of self-worth. I was sleeping on a cot, eating donated food, and wondering if I'd ever be more than a cautionary tale. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. Then someone I met here made a phone call. A week later, I had a job interview at Ashford Properties. Today, I'm the new director of their community outreach division, overseeing the affordable housing initiative. Richard hadn't told anyone about hiring James. He had wanted the man to succeed on his own merits, to earn his position without the burden of charity. But Daniel had figured it out, and his son's smile from across the room told Richard everything he needed to know about approval and pride. After the ceremony, Marcus approached Richard with his ever-present notebook. Mr. Ashford, can I show you something? The boy opened to a fresh page covered in detailed architectural drawings. It showed a mixed-use development with affordable housing on lower floors, market-rate condos above, and ground-level space for community services. Every detail had been carefully considered: green spaces for children, accessible entries for elderly residents, solar panels on the roof. This is my vision for the empty lot on 53rd Street, Marcus explained. A building that serves everyone, not just rich people. Where someone like my mom could afford an apartment, but it wouldn't feel like public housing. Where people of different backgrounds could be neighbors instead of strangers. Richard studied the drawings with a professional eye, noting the sophistication of the design, the innovative use of space, the clear understanding of both aesthetics and functionality. This 10-year-old boy had grasped concepts that many experienced architects struggled with. "Marcus, this is brilliant," Richard said honestly. "Have you shown this to Daniel?" "Not yet. I wanted your opinion first." Marcus looked up at him with those old, wise eyes. "You're a builder, Mr. Ashford. You know if something like this could really work." Richard knelt down to the boy's eye level, something he never would have done 6 months ago. "It could work. It should work. And I'll tell you what, when you're ready, when you've finished school and gotten your architecture degree, you come work for me. We'll build this together." Marcus's face transformed with joy so pure it hurt to witness. "You mean it? Really?" "I never say things I don't mean," Richard replied, then smiled. "Well, I'm trying not to anymore." Daniel joined them, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "What's going on here?" "Your dad just promised me a job," Marcus said, practically vibrating with excitement. "In like 10 years, but still. He's going to help me build my design." Daniel looked at his father, and Richard saw something he hadn't seen in years: unguarded love. "That's a pretty serious commitment, Dad. Think you can keep it?" "I kept coming back here, didn't I?" Richard stood, facing his son. "I've learned that the promises we make to people matter more than the contracts we sign. That treating people with dignity isn't weakness, it's the only real strength that exists." He gestured around the room at the celebrating graduates, the volunteers, the staff, the lives being slowly rebuilt. "This matters more than any deal I've ever closed." Margaret approached them, her eyes glistening. "Richard, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped into her small office, cluttered with files and photos of shelter residents who had moved on to better lives. Margaret closed the door and turned to him with an expression of fierce intensity. "6 months ago, you walked in here wearing a $3,000 suit, looking at us like we were specimens in a zoo," she said bluntly. "I almost threw you out. The only reason I didn't was because Daniel vouched for you, said you were capable of change even though you'd forgotten how to be human." Richard accepted the assessment without flinching. "You would have been right to throw me out. But something happened," Margaret continued. "You kept coming back. You did the work without complaint. You listened to people's stories without judgment. You used your resources to help without making it about your ego." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What I'm trying to say is that you've become one of our most valuable volunteers. Not because of your money, but because of your presence. People here respect you. They trust you. You show them that change is possible at any age, from any starting point." "They taught me that," Richard said softly. "Every single person in this shelter has taught me something about resilience, dignity, and grace under impossible circumstances. I came here thinking I would be the teacher, the benefactor, the superior one. Instead, I've been the student." Margaret smiled. "Good. Because I have a favor to ask. We're expanding our job training program, adding new courses in construction skills, business management, and entrepreneurship. We need someone to design and oversee it, someone who understands both the business world and the barriers our clients face." She met his eyes. "I want you to do it. Not as a donor, but as a partner. What do you say?" Richard thought about his calendar, packed with meetings and deadlines and obligations. Then he thought about Marcus's drawings, Carlos's pride, James's second chance, Daniel's slow thaw. He thought about the boy he had been, hungry and afraid and certain he would never matter. And he thought about the man he was becoming, finally understanding that mattering had nothing to do with wealth or power or conquest. "I'll do it," he said. "On one condition." "What's that?" "That Daniel co-leads it with me. This is his world, his vision. I'm just learning to see what is always known." Later that night, Richard sat in his study once more, but this time Daniel was with him, both of them reviewing plans for the new training program. The shirt that had started everything hung framed on the wall now, a reminder of the gift Marcus had given him, the courage to remember who he used to be and the opportunity to become someone better. "Dad," Daniel said, looking up from his notes. "I'm proud of you. I know that probably doesn't mean much compared to board approval or market performance, but I needed to say it." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It means everything. You saved my life, Daniel. You and Marcus and everyone at that shelter. You reminded me that success without purpose is just expensive emptiness." "So what happens now?" Daniel asked. Richard smiled, and it felt genuine, unforced, real. Now we build something that matters. Not towers that scrape the sky, but foundations that lift people up. Not empires that crush competition, but communities that create opportunity. He looked at his son, his heir, his teacher. Now we become the men we were always supposed to be. Outside, the city glittered with possibilities, each light a life, each life a story worth honoring. Richard Ashford had spent 30 years conquering that city, taking everything he could grab. Now, finally, he would spend whatever time remained giving back, building up, and learning that the only legacy worth leaving was measured in lives touched rather than dollars earned. The transformation wasn't complete. He still struggled with old instincts, still caught himself thinking in terms of profit and loss rather than people and purpose. But every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he returned to St. Catherine's, rolled up his sleeves, and remembered why any of it mattered. And when he looked at his son, working beside him with quiet determination and unwavering compassion, Richard Ashford understood the greatest truth of all: real wealth wasn't counted in bank accounts or properties or power. It was measured in second chances given, in dignity restored, in hope rekindled. It was found in a 10-year-old boy brave enough to confront a billionaire with the truth. It was discovered in a shirt freely given to a stranger in need. It was everything he had spent his life chasing, finally found in the last place he thought to look, in the act of simply being human.